The alien queen mocked Earth's heroes, until a human walked into her armor. Hall, the ship that carried Katie Morris and her team through space, was small compared to the alien vessels that surrounded it, and the windows showed stars that looked wrong, because they were so far from home, and Katie sat in her seat with her hands folded in her lap, and tried not to think about how many ways this could go badly. She was 42 years old and had gray in her hair that she did not bother to dye anymore, and her uniform was clean but worn at the edges because she had been wearing uniforms for more than 20 years. And comfort mattered more than appearance now, and the medal on her chest was for bravery in combat. But she did not feel brave at the moment. The other members of the delegation sat nearby, and they were all quiet because there was nothing left to say, and they had gone over the plan 100 times, and everyone knew their role, and everyone knew that the plan would probably fail, but they were going anyway because someone had to. Lieutenant Jake Palmer sat across from Katie, and he was young enough to be her son, and his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking, and Katie wanted to tell him that it was okay to be scared, but she did not, because fear was contagious and she needed everyone to hold together for just a few more hours. Next to Jake was Dr. Lisa Chang, who was the smartest person Katie had ever met, and she had 3 degrees and spoke 6 languages and had been chosen for this mission because someone needed to understand the alien technology if they got a chance to see it. And Lisa sat very still with her eyes closed, and Katie knew she was running through calculations in her head the way some people prayed. The last member of the team was Commander Ray Foster, who was technically in charge of the mission, even though everyone knew that Katie would do most of the talking, and Ray was 55 and had been in the Navy for 30 years. And he had a calm way of speaking that made people feel safer even when everything was going wrong. And right now he was looking out the window at the alien fleet, and his face showed nothing at all. The alien ships were beautiful, in a way that human ships were not, and they looked like they had been grown instead of built, and their surfaces were smooth and changed color in the light, and they moved through space, like fish through water, and there were hundreds of them surrounding. The small human vessel, a voice came through the speakers, and it spoke in English with an accent that sounded almost British, and it said that they were approaching the flagship, and that they should prepare to dock, and that any attempt to bring weapons aboard would result in immediate destruction. Katie touched the empty holster on her belt where her sidearm usually sat, and felt naked without it, and she had carried a gun for so long that her body felt unbalanced without the weight, and she knew the others felt the same way. The docking was smooth, and there was barely a bump when the ships connected, and a door opened in the wall, and beyond it was a corridor that glowed with soft purple light, and the air that came through smelled like flowers and electricity and something else that had no name in any human language. They stood and checked each other's uniforms one last time, and Ray straightened Katie's collar, and she nodded her thanks, and then they walked through the door, into the alien ship, and the door closed behind them with a sound like a sigh. The corridor was wider than it needed to be, and the ceiling was so high that it disappeared into shadows, and the walls seemed to pulse slightly like they were breathing, and their footsteps made no sound on the floor. And Katie realized that the floor was soft, like it was covered in moss, even though it looked like stone. They walked for what felt like miles, and the corridor never changed. And there were no doors or windows and no signs of life except for the pulsing walls, and Katie started to wonder if this was some kind of test or trap, when finally they came to a large door that opened silently as they approached. Beyond the door was a room that took Katie's breath away, and it was enormous and circular, and the walls rose up in tiers like an ancient amphitheater, and the ceiling was so far above that it might as well have been the sky. And in the center of the room on a raised platform was a throne. The throne was made of crystal that looked like it was still growing, and it caught the purple light and split it into colors that Katie had never seen before. And sitting on the throne was Queen Valith. Katie had seen pictures of the alien queen, but they had not prepared her for the reality. And Valith was tall and slim, and her skin was so pale it was almost translucent, and her hair was white and fell past her shoulders like a waterfall, and her ears came to sharp points that extended several inches from her head, and her eyes were completely black with no white at all, and when she looked at Katie it felt like being examined under a microscope. The queen wore robes that seemed to be made of liquid silver, and they moved around her like they were alive, and on her head was a crown that was just a thin band of gold with a single purple gem in the center, and the gem pulsed in time with the walls, But what caught Katie's attention were the 3 dragons that lay at the queen's feet. They were not the huge beasts from human mythology, but they were still impressive, and each one was about the size of a large wolf, and their scales shifted between colors as they moved and went from deep blue to green to silver and back again, and their eyes glowed with a yellow light, and they watched the humans with an intelligence that was unsettling. One of the dragons raised its head and made a sound that was like wind chimes and music and warning all at once, and the queen reached down and touched its head with long fingers that had too many joints, and the dragon settled but did not stop watching. Queen Valeth spoke, and her voice came from everywhere at once, and it was beautiful and terrible, and she said welcome to her ship and welcome to their deaths if they were foolish, and she smiled when she said it, and her teeth were very white and very sharp. Katie stepped forward, and the dragons all raised their heads, and their scales began to glow brighter, and she stopped and waited until the queen made a gesture, and the dragons relaxed slightly. Katie said that she came to speak for Earth and that her people wanted peace but would fight if they had to, and her voice sounded small in the enormous room, but she kept it steady. The queen laughed, and it sounded like breaking glass, and she said that every species said they would fight, and that every species was wrong, and that Earth would surrender within a week, or everyone on it would die, and it was really very simple. She said that humans were a young species, and young species always thought they were special, and always thought they could resist, and they were always wrong. And she had conquered 1,000 worlds, and Earth would be the 1,000. And first Katie felt Jake tense beside her, and she put a hand on his arm to keep him still, and she said that perhaps the queen would like to show them why they should surrender, and perhaps there was evidence that would convince them. The queen tilted her head and looked at Katie with those black eyes, and something like interest crossed her face, and she said that humans were at least polite in their defiance, and that yes, she would show them her armor hall where the equipment of every champion who had challenged her hung on the walls, and where the human's armor would hang soon enough. She stood, and the dragon stood with her, and she was even taller than Katie had thought, and she gestured for them to follow, and she walked toward a doorway that had not been there a moment before, and the dragons followed, and after a moment the humans followed too, and Katie wondered if they would ever see their ship again. The corridor they walked through was different from the first one, and the walls here were covered in symbols that hurt to look at and made Katie's eyes water, and when she blinked, the symbols seemed to move and rearrange themselves, and she had to look away before she got dizzy. The 3 dragons walked behind the queen with their claws making soft clicking sounds on the floor, and their breath came out in small clouds even though the air was warm, and Katie realized that the dragons were cold-blooded or maybe something else entirely, and she filed that information away because everything she learned might be useful. Later, Dr. Lisa Chang was walking close to the walls and examining the symbols, and Katie saw her lips moving as she tried to work out what they meant, and Lisa had always been like that, and could not see something unknown without trying to understand it, and Katie admired that, even though right now it seemed like a waste of time, because they would probably all be dead soon. Commander Ray Foster walked with his military posture and his face calm, but Katie had known him long enough to see the tension in his shoulders and the way his eyes kept tracking the dragons, and she knew he was calculating distances and thinking about how to fight them if it came to that, and it probably would not help. But old habits died hard. Lieutenant Jake Palmer was breathing too fast, and Katie could hear it, and she moved closer to him and spoke quietly and told him to slow his breathing and count to 4 on the inhale and 4 on the exhale, and he nodded and tried. And after a minute he was calmer, and she squeezed his shoulder once. The queen did not look back at them, and she moved through the corridors like she owned them, which of course she did, and she took turns without hesitation, and Katie tried to memorize the route. But after the 7th or 8th turn, she gave up because the corridors all looked the same, and she suspected they might actually change when no one was looking. They passed through rooms that seemed to have no purpose, and one room was filled with floating spheres of water that hung in the air without anything holding them, and fish swam in the spheres, and the fish were bright colors and had too many fins, and one of the dragons paused to watch them. But the queen made a sound, and the dragon hurried to catch up. Another room had windows that looked out onto a planet that was covered in purple vegetation and had 3 moons, and Katie realized they must be moving through space because the planet was getting smaller as she watched. and she had not felt any acceleration at all, and she wondered what kind of technology could do that. The Queen stopped at a door that was larger than the others, and it was made of some kind of black metal that seemed to absorb light, and there were no handles or controls that Katie could see, and the Queen placed her hand on the door, and it opened silently, and beyond it was darkness. The Queen walked into the darkness, and the dragons followed, and Katie hesitated for just a moment, and then followed because there was no point in coming this far, and then turning back, and the others came after her, and as soon as they were all inside, lights began to glow. The armor hall was bigger than any building Katie had ever been inside, and it stretched away in all directions, and the ceiling was so high that it was lost in shadows, and hanging from the ceiling, and mounted on the walls, and standing on pedestals were thousands of sets of armor and weapons. Each set was different, and they came from different worlds and different species, and some were made of metal, and some of crystal, and some of materials that looked organic, and some that looked like they were made of light or shadow or something in between. The Queen walked slowly into the hall, and her footsteps echoed, and the dragons spread out slightly and began to explore, and they sniffed at the armor and made small sounds, and the Queen did not stop them. Katie followed and looked at the nearest set of armor, and it was made for something much larger than a human, and it had 4 arms, and the helmet had 3 eyes, and the metal was covered in dents and scratches, and there was a hole through the chest plate that was big enough to put her fist through. The Queen noticed her looking, and she stopped and came over, and she said that armor had belonged to a warrior from the Krell Empire, and he had been 9 feet, tall and strong enough to bend steel, and he had killed 43 of her soldiers before she killed him herself, and his people had surrendered the next day. She moved to the next set, and this one was smaller and made of something that looked like blue glass, and she said this had belonged to a warrior from a world whose name could not be spoken in human language, and the warrior had been able to turn invisible, and had tried to assassinate her and had gotten within 3 feet before one of her dragons sensed it, and now that world paid tribute every year. She continued through the hall and pointed to different pieces and told stories, and each story ended the same way, with the warrior dead, and their world conquered, and her voice was pleasant and conversational, like she was giving a tour of a museum. And in a way, Lisa had pulled out a small tablet and was taking notes, and the Queen saw this and laughed and said that it would not matter, because the tablet would not work outside the ship and all the information would be erased. And Lisa looked at the tablet and her face fell, and Katie felt a surge of anger but kept it off her face. Jake was staring at a sword that was taller than he was, and the blade seemed to be on fire, but the fire did not spread and did not give off heat. And the Queen said that sword had killed 2 of her dragons before she took it from the warrior who wielded it and melted the warrior alive, and Jake stepped back from the sword. Quickly, Ray was examining a set of armor that looked almost human, and he asked the Queen about it, and she smiled and said that yes, it was from Earth and from a human colony on a planet called New Terra, and the colony had tried to resist her 50 years ago, and the soldier who wore that armor had been their champion. She walked over to the armor and touched it gently and said the soldier's name had been Chen, and he had been brave and skilled, and had killed 12 of her warriors before she overwhelmed him with numbers, and his colony had surrendered after she sent them his helmet, and now New Terra was a productive member of her empire. Katie felt cold, and she asked if there were other human colonies in the empire, and the Queen said, yes, there were 7, and they had all tried to resist, and they had all failed, and their champion's armor was all here in her hall. She gestured to a section of the wall, and Katie saw them, and there were 7 sets of armor, and each one was damaged, and each one represented a failure, and she walked closer and looked at each one and tried to remember that these had been real people who had fought and died. The Queen watched her and said that humans always thought they were special and that their fighting spirit would make a difference, and she had heard it all before, and it never mattered. And courage could not stop superior technology, and determination could not stop superior numbers. Katie turned to look at the Queen, and the 3 dragons had gathered near their mistress and were watching Katie with glowing eyes, and Katie said that the Queen was right and that humans were not special, and the Queen looked surprised. Katie said that humans lost fights all the time and that they were actually pretty bad at a lot of things, and that anyone human was not much of a threat, and the Queen nodded like this was obvious. But Katie continued and said that the problem was that humans never fought as one, and they fought as 8 billion. The Queen's expression changed and she tilted her head, and her black eyes focused on Katie with an intensity that was almost physical. And the 3 dragons stopped moving and turned to face Katie as well. And the room suddenly felt much colder. Katie took a breath and continued, and she said that the Queen had conquered 7 human colonies, and that was impressive. But those colonies had been small and far from Earth, and each one had maybe a few million people, and Earth had 8 billion people, and that was a different problem entirely. She said that the Queen could kill 1 million humans and barely make a dent in Earth's population, and she could kill 10 million, and there would still be billions left. And every single one of those billions would know what happened and would be angry and would want revenge. The Queen started to speak, but Katie held up a hand and kept talking, and she knew she was being disrespectful, but they were going to die anyway, so she might as well say everything. And she said that the Queen's empire was built on fear and on quick victories, and on making examples of champions so that everyone else would surrender. She walked closer to the armor from New Terra and touched it, and the metal was cold under her fingers, and she said that this soldier Chen had fought alone or maybe with a small team, and when he died his people gave up, because they knew they could not win. But Earth was different. And Katie said that on Earth there were countries that had been at war with each other for hundreds of years, and there were groups that had been fighting for generations over land or religion or resources, and humans knew how to hold a grudge and how to keep fighting, even when it seemed hopeless. She turned back to the Queen and said that if the Queen killed Earth's champions, then Earth would just make new champions. And if she destroyed Earth's armies, then Earth would build new armies. And if she bombed Earth's cities, then humans would fight from the rubble in the forest and the mountains. The Queen's face was hard to read, but Katie thought she saw something that might have been doubt, or maybe just curiosity. And one of the dragons made a low sound in its throat, and the Queen looked down at it and touched its head. And the dragon quieted. Katie said that the Queen had said Earth would surrender in a week. And maybe that was true if Earth fought the way the Queen expected. But humans did not always do what was expected. And the Queen could probably win any battle she wanted, but winning battles was not the same as winning wars. She asked the Queen how long the longest war in her empire had lasted, and the Queen was silent for a moment, and then said that the Krell had resisted for 3 years before they were completely conquered, and that had been the longest. Katie nodded and said that on Earth there had been wars that lasted 30 years, and one that had technically lasted over 100 years with periods of peace in between, and humans were good at long wars because humans were stubborn and stupid and did not know when to quit. Dr. Lisa Chang stepped forward, and her voice was quiet but steady, and she said that she had studied the Queen's empire and that most of the conquered species had been united or nearly united when the Queen arrived, and they had centralized governments and clear chains of command, and when those governments fell, the species surrendered. But Earth had almost 200 different countries and thousands of different cultures and millions of different communities, and if the Queen destroyed one government, there would be dozens of others still fighting. And if she destroyed all the governments, then the fighting would become decentralized and even harder to stop. Commander Ray Foster added that Earth's military was not one force but many forces, and each country had its own armies and navies and air forces, and they did not always get along, but they would all fight an alien invasion. And even if the Queen destroyed every organized military on Earth, there were billions of civilians who owned weapons and knew how to use them. Lieutenant Jake Palmer surprised everyone by speaking up, and his voice shook a little, but he kept going. And he said that Earth had something like 400 million privately owned firearms, and that did not count military weapons, and every one of those guns was in the hands of someone who would be angry if aliens invaded and would probably do something stupid like try to fight back. The Queen listened to all of this, and her face showed nothing, and the dragons had moved closer to her and were pressing against her legs like they were trying to comfort her, or maybe protect her. And Katie noticed that one of the dragons kept looking at her instead of watching its mistress. Katie took another step forward, and she was now close enough that she could see the details of the Queen's face and the way her skin seemed to glow from within. And she said that the Queen had a choice to make, and she could try to conquer Earth and spend the next 50 or 100 years fighting a guerrilla war against a species that would never surrender. Or she could leave Earth alone and go find easier targets, and there were plenty of other worlds out there that would surrender quickly and would not cause her centuries of trouble. And Katie said she knew which choice she would make if she were in the Queen's position. The Queen was very quiet, and the only sound was the breathing of the dragons and the soft hum of the ship around them. And Katie waited and felt her heart pounding, but kept her face calm. Finally, the Queen spoke, and her voice was softer than before, and she asked why Katie thought this would work, and why she thought the Queen would believe any of it. Katie said that the Queen should look at human history, and look at all the times humans had fought against impossible odds and kept fighting anyway, and she should look at the wars that had lasted generations and the resistance movements that had never stopped, and the Queen had access to Earth's databases and could verify everything Katie was saying. She said that the Queen was smart and had built an empire by being smart and by choosing her battles carefully, and that was why her empire had lasted, and that was why she should choose not to fight this battle. One of the dragons left the Queen's side and walked over to Katie, and it was the one that had been watching her, and it stopped right in front of her and looked up at her with its glowing yellow eyes, and Katie held very still because she did not know what it would do. The dragon sniffed at her hand and then pressed its head against her palm, and Katie reflexively scratched behind its ears the way she would with a dog, and the dragon made a sound that was almost like a purr and leaned into her touch. The Queen watched this, and her eyes widened slightly, and she said that her dragons had never done that before, and they did not like strangers and certainly did not like potential enemies, and she asked Katie what she had done. Katie said she had not done anything, and that maybe the dragon just recognized someone who was telling the truth, and she kept scratching behind its ears, and the dragon's scales were warm under her fingers and felt like smooth stone. The other two dragons looked at their companion and then at Katie, and one of them took a step toward her, and the Queen made a sound and it stopped, but it looked like it wanted to come closer. The Queen studied Katie for a long moment, and then she said that perhaps Earth was more trouble than it was worth, and that there were indeed other worlds that would be easier to conquer, and she would consider leaving Earth alone for now. Katie felt relief wash over her, but she kept her face neutral and said that was all she could ask, and that Earth would stay in its own territory and would not interfere with the Queen's empire. The Queen nodded and said that if humans ever entered her space, she would consider it an act of war, and Katie agreed, and the dragon at her feet made a disappointed sound when she stopped scratching its ears. The walk back through the corridors felt different than the walk in, and Katie could feel the tension draining from her shoulders, and Jake was breathing easier, and even Ray looked less like he was preparing for a fight, and Lisa was still looking at everything with curious eyes, but now there was hope in them, instead of just the desperate need to learn everything before they died. The Queen walked ahead of them, and her silver robes flowed behind her, and the three dragons followed. But one of them kept looking back at Katie, and she recognized it as the one that had approached her in the armor hall, and every time it looked back, the Queen noticed, and her expression became more thoughtful. They reached the throne room again, and the Queen climbed the steps to her crystal throne and sat down, and the dragons arranged themselves at her feet. But the one that had befriended Katie sat a little apart from the others and kept its glowing eyes on her. The Queen said that the humans could return to their ship and return to Earth and carry her message that she would not attack Earth at this time, but that the truce was fragile and depended on humans staying in their own space and not interfering with her empire. Katie nodded and said that Earth understood and would honor the agreement, and she was about to turn to leave when the Queen held up a hand. The Queen said that she wanted to understand something, and she asked Katie if she had been afraid, and Katie said yes, she had been terrified and still was a little bit. The Queen looked surprised, and she said that Katie had not shown fear and had spoken boldly, and had even dared to lecture a queen, who could have killed her with a thought. Katie said that being afraid and showing fear were two different things, and that she had been a soldier long enough to know that sometimes you had to act brave even when you were not, and that fear was useful because it kept you alert, but it could not be allowed to control. The Queen considered this and then asked if Katie had really believed what she said about humans never surrendering, or if it had been a bluff. Katie said it was not a bluff, and that everything she said was true, and that human history was full of examples of people fighting against overwhelming odds and refusing to give up. And sometimes they lost, but sometimes they won. And the point was that they always fought. She said that there were stories of cities that had held out against sieges for years, and of resistance movements that had lasted decades, and of wars that had been fought across generations, and humans had a saying about it being better to die on your feet than live on your knees. The Queen said that her people had a different saying, and that it was better to be alive and serving than dead and free. And Katie said that was probably a smarter saying. But humans were not always smart. One of the dragons made a sound like laughter, and the Queen looked at it with surprise. And then a small smile crossed her face, and she said that perhaps her dragons liked humans more than she did. Katie asked if the dragons were intelligent, and the Queen said yes. They were very intelligent, and had their own language and their own culture. And they chose to serve her because she had raised them from eggs and had bonded with them. But they were not pets or slaves. She said that dragons lived for thousands of years, and these three were still young and were curious about everything, and the one that had approached Katie was named Silverscale because of the way its scales caught. The light Katie looked at Silverscale, and the dragon looked back, and she asked if she could approach, and the Queen hesitated, and then nodded. Katie walked slowly toward the throne, and Silverscale stood up and met her halfway, and she knelt down to be at its level, and the dragon pushed its head into her hands, and she scratched behind its ears and along its neck, and the dragon made that purring sound again. The Queen watched and said that Silverscale had never acted this way with anyone except her, and she asked Katie if she had experience with animals. Katie said she had grown up on a farm and had worked with horses and dogs and cats and even a few more exotic animals, and she had learned that most creatures responded well to calm confidence and gentle handling, and that being afraid made animals nervous. She said that when Silverscale had approached her in the armor hall, she had been scared, but she had also recognized curiosity in its eyes and had decided to trust her instincts and treat it like she would treat any animal that was deciding whether to trust her. Silverscale's scales were warm and smooth and felt almost like metal, but with a slight give to them, and the dragon leaned heavily into Katie's hands and its eyes half closed in contentment. The other two dragons watched, and Katie could see them becoming less wary, and after a moment, one of them stood and walked over and sniffed at her, and she extended a hand slowly, and it let her touch its head. And this dragon's scales were more blue than silver. The Queen said that dragon was named Deepwater and was the calmest of the three, and the third dragon was named Stormwing and was the most aggressive, and Stormwing was watching from the throne steps, but had not moved. Katie spent a few more minutes with the dragons, and then stood and thanked the Queen for allowing it, and the Queen said that it had been educational, and that perhaps she had underestimated humans. She said that most species either cowered before her or tried to attack her, and very few tried to talk to her as an equal, and even fewer showed kindness to her dragons without expecting something in return. Katie said that she had not done it expecting anything, and that she just liked animals, and that the dragons seemed lonely. And the Queen's expression shifted, and for a moment she looked almost vulnerable. The Queen said that yes, the dragons were sometimes lonely because most species feared them, and would not come near them, and her own people treated them with respect, but also with distance, and it had been a long time since anyone had scratched Silverscale's ears. Katie said she was sorry to hear that, and the Queen shook her head and said it was not important, and that Katie should return to her ship now before she changed her mind about the truce. Katie nodded and gestured to her team, and they moved toward the door. But as they reached it, the Queen called out and said that Katie was welcome to return if Earth ever needed to negotiate again, and that she would receive her. Katie turned and said she hoped that would not be necessary, but that she appreciated the offer, and the Queen smiled, and it was a real smile, not the cruel one from earlier, as they walked back through the corridors to their ship. Jake asked Katie if she had really not been scared when she was petting the dragon, and Katie laughed and said she had been absolutely terrified, and that the dragon probably weighed 300 pounds and had teeth like daggers and could have killed her easily. But she said that sometimes you had to do the scary thing anyway, and that showing fear would have made the dragon more nervous and might have triggered an attack, and acting calm had been the safest option, even though it had not felt safe. Ray said that Katie had nerves of steel, and Lisa said that Katie had saved all their lives with her speech about human stubbornness, and Katie said that she had just told the truth, and that the Queen was smart enough to do the math. Their ship was waiting where they had left it, and they boarded quickly, and the docking clamps released, and they pulled away from the alien flagship, and the alien fleet let them go without incident. As they moved away from the fleet and prepared to jump back to Earth, Katie looked out the window at the massive ships and wondered if they would really stay away or if this was just a temporary reprieve. The jump back to Earth took 3 days, and Katie spent most of that time writing her report and trying to explain what had happened in a way that would make sense to the people who had not been there, and it was harder than she expected because some of it did not make sense even to her. She wrote about the throne room and the armor hall, and the thousands of sets of equipment from conquered worlds, and she wrote about the Queen's confidence and the way she had expected Earth to surrender immediately. And she wrote about the dragons, and especially about Silverscale. Jake spent his time reviewing the recordings from their helmet cameras and trying to analyze the alien technology they had seen, and he admitted that most of it was beyond his understanding, but he cataloged everything anyway because someone back on Earth might be able to make sense of it. Lisa filled 3 notebooks with observations and calculations and theories about how the alien ships worked and how the Queen's empire was organized and what their weaknesses might be. And she said that the Queen had been right about the tablet being erased, but she had a good memory and had memorized as much as she could. Ray spent his time thinking about military strategy and what Earth should do next, and he said that they had bought time but not safety, and that Earth needed to prepare for the possibility that the Queen would change her mind, or that some other threat would appear when they finally arrived at Earth. They were met by a fleet of human ships that escorted them to a space station, and from there they were taken to Geneva, where the United Nations had assembled representatives from every member nation to hear their report. Katie stood in front of hundreds of people and told them everything that had happened, and she showed them the recordings and answered their questions, and some people believed her and some people thought she had been tricked, or that the threat was not as serious as she claimed, but most people understood that Earth had been very close to war, and that they had been saved not by superior technology or military might, but by convincing one alien queen that humans were more trouble than they were worth. The Secretary General asked Katie what she thought would happen next, and Katie said honestly that she did not know, and that the Queen might keep her word or might attack in a year or 10 years or never, and that Earth needed to be ready for anything. She said that Earth should continue developing better technology and building defenses, but should also try to make contact with other species and form alliances because the Queen's empire was huge, but the galaxy was bigger, and there must be other civilizations that were also trying to survive. Over the next few months, Earth did exactly that, and sent out ships to explore and make contact and built new weapons and defenses, and trained soldiers for a war that might never come. And Katie was promoted to general and put in charge of coordinating Earth's defense efforts. She worked 18-hour days and traveled constantly, and met with leaders from every country, and tried to build something that had never existed before, which was a truly unified human military force, and it was exhausting and frustrating and sometimes seemed impossible. But slowly it came together, and countries that had been enemies learned to work together, and resources were shared, and technology was developed, and Earth began to look less like a collection of separate nations and more like a united world. 2 years after the meeting with Queen Valith, a ship arrived at Earth's orbit, and it was not a warship, but a small courier vessel, and it carried a message from the Queen. The message said that the Queen was pleased that Earth had honored the agreement and had stayed within its own space, and that she wanted to establish formal diplomatic relations and perhaps even trade agreements. Katie was chosen to lead the diplomatic mission, and she traveled back to the alien flagship with a larger team this time and representatives from several countries. And when she walked into the throne room, the Queen was waiting. The 3 dragons were there as well, and Silverscale recognized Katie immediately and came bounding over like an oversized puppy, and nearly knocked her down, and Katie laughed and scratched its ears, and the dragon made happy sounds. The Queen stood and walked down from her throne, and she said that Silverscale had been impossible to live with after Katie left and had moped around for weeks and had finally convinced her that humans might be worth knowing. After all, Katie said she was glad to see Silverscale again, and the dragon was now even larger than before, and its scales had more silver in them. And the queen said that dragons grew quickly when they were young, and that Silverscale was entering adolescence, which was apparently a difficult time for dragons. Just like it was for humans, the negotiations took weeks and were complicated, and there were many disagreements about trade routes and territory and technology sharing and cultural exchange, but eventually they reached an agreement that both sides could accept. Earth would trade resources and agricultural products that were unique to their world, and the Queen's empire would trade advanced medicine and certain technologies that were not weapons, and both sides would respect each other's borders and would help defend each other if attacked by outside forces. It was not a perfect agreement, and many people on both sides were unhappy with it. But it was better than war, and it opened up possibilities that had not existed before. Katie visited the alien flagship many times over the next few years, and each time Silverscale greeted her enthusiastically, and the Queen became less formal and more friendly, and eventually admitted that she had been impressed by Katie's courage and had wanted to find a way to avoid unnecessary conflict. She said that her empire had been built on conquest, but that she was old now and tired of war, and that perhaps it was time to try something different. And Katie had given her an excuse to change course without appearing weak. Katie said she was glad she could help, and the Queen smiled and said that Katie was either very brave or very foolish, and probably both, and that those were good qualities in a diplomat. On one visit, the Queen asked Katie if she would be willing to take Silverscale back to Earth for a while, and said that the dragon needed to learn about other cultures and other ways of thinking, and that Silverscale had formed a bond with Katie that was rare and precious. Katie was surprised but agreed, and Silverscale came to Earth and lived in the mountains of Colorado, where the air was thin and cold like the dragon preferred, and became something of a celebrity, and children came from all over the world to see the alien dragon that had helped prevent a war. Silverscale seemed happy on Earth and would fly over the mountains and swim in the cold lakes, and would visit Katie whenever she was home, and would curl up by her fireplace like a giant cat, and they would sit together in comfortable silence. The Queen visited once and saw Silverscale flying free over the mountains, and said that the dragon looked happier than it had ever been in her palace, and Katie said that maybe everyone needed a place where they felt free. The Queen agreed and said that perhaps that was what Earth had been trying to tell her all along, and that freedom was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed hopeless. Years passed, and Earth joined a galactic community of worlds that were not part of the Queen's empire, and formed alliances and trade agreements, and slowly became a recognized power in its own right, and the war that everyone had feared never came. Katie eventually retired from military service and built a house in the Colorado mountains, near where Silverscale lived, and spent her days writing and hiking and playing with a dragon that had once belonged to an alien queen. And sometimes when she sat on her porch and watched Silverscale soaring through the sky, she thought about that day in the armor hall when she had gambled everything on the hope that one alien queen would choose peace over war, and she was grateful that the gamble had paid off. The story of Katie Morris and Queen Valeth became legend and was told on hundreds of worlds, and it was a story about courage and diplomacy and the power of connection, and about how sometimes the smallest gestures could change the course of history. And it was a story about a dragon named Silverscale who had seen something in a human that no one else had seen, and had chosen friendship over fear, and had helped build a bridge between two species that had almost destroyed each other.